Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I am talking to Cyber Dandy once again, and we are talking about the history of the IWW and its relationship to anti-communism. In short, uh, most of the Red Scares hit the IWW historically pretty early and sometimes first. So depending on the time period. But to do that, we have to kind of understand what the IWW was, what it represented, its relationship to other socialist groups. And so I'm going to let Cyber Dandy really start off on here. And can you give our listeners, if they're not into the lefty lore, which we all kind of share, let's say you're a baby leftist and maybe you know a lot about the Bolsheviks, but you don't know anything about the American socialist tradition, which is pretty common. What is the IWW and how did it start?
All right. So the basic way that the IWW will be introduced is to explain what the difference is between a craft union and an industrial union.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it began in 1905, the AFL, which was not the AFL-CIO yet, was a craft union, which meant that it was only concerned with really high-skilled labor, and it organized workers based on their specific skill. So you would have a workplace where you would have different workers belonging to different craft unions, and it wasn't organized industry wide. And so you would get all sorts of things like workers in one company not showing solidarity with workers in another, and just a lot of discoordination and things like that.
Or even workers in one area of the building not showing solidarity with other workers in one area of the building, because craft unionization, for people who want an example of it still existing, for example, if you are in the pilots union, versus like Delta being unionized, or if you want a very vivid example of it, the union laws that govern railways were exempted from the National Labor Relations Act, and thus they are still organized on craft union lines. So the engineers, etc., the brake people, etc., all are different unions, even if they're in the same railway company. My school building is actually craft unionized. So while administration and teachers are together, which is suspect, other educational professionals are in a separate union, because they're, quote, not contract workers, so they have different concerns, which I think is kind of a disaster, because the state and the district in the past has actually played one off of the other. So it still exists today, because of the CIO, which has a tenuous relationship to communism, because of the communist unions joining into the CIO. The CIO is where kind of industrial unionization becomes normalized in America. But the IWW precedes the CIO by like a generation. So,
right.
So that's important to understand. So the AFL, I mean, and the AFL was often suppressed too, even though it was highly craft based. If you think that the industrial unions were racist, you got nothing on how the AFL actually ran.
Right.
Often they even opposed the concept of striking. I mean, like it wasn't. It is to say that craft unions are like guilds is almost an insult to guilds.
Yeah, I mean it is. It should really be emphasized. Just like when anarchists make the critique that unions are just managers of the relationship between labor and capital, that wasn't even a critique from the eyes of the AFL. That is what they wanted. And they were totally on board with what they call just plain unionism, or just like, I forget exactly what the term is, but it's something like just simple unionism, where they wanted to work out and negotiate, as quickly as possible, a way to settle disputes between management and the workers. And they did not have any kind of notion of class war or class struggle. It was really a unity between management and the workforce in a way that you wouldn't think makes sense if you're a socialist. So the AFL idea was not an idea of class struggle. It was not an idea of workers really being against capital. And they really weren't trying to do anything as far as advance the cause of socialism. And so they weren't opposed just by the IWW or by anarchists. The socialists didn't really like the AFL, being the socialists in the Socialist Labor Party and the Socialist Party. And just really anyone that was not a liberal. It's almost like you could think of the AFL as a liberal version of a union at the time. And in fact, it was called yellow unionism. So that is like kind of the first couple of things. The other major thing is that they didn't organize undocumented workers. They didn't organize unskilled workers. And so like miners, lumbermen, shipyard workers, all of these people were not unionized by the AFL or by anyone else at the time.
Yeah, and that's a pretty big problem as far as it goes. So where do you think that actually leaves the labor movement in America? Because you have the Knights of Labor, who are, not as craft union oriented, but they also they oppose things like strikes. They're also kind of they're suspicious of unskilled labor. They're definitely suspicious of migrant and immigrant labor, although that's a problem in all the movements at the time, except the IWW and the SLP. The Socialist Party of America is all over the place on immigration. So we have that history. Now, there's a specific thing in which the AFL, I mean, not the AFL, the IWW comes out of, which is mining labor. And that's what, when people think about the historic period, the historic and heroic period of the IWW, they're mostly thinking about mining strikes.
Right.
And we do have to remind people the conditions in these mines in America were, frankly, almost feudal, because it was closed shop. You were paid in company script. Now that may seem really weird to us. Wasn't entirely weird in the 19th century, because for most of the 19th century there wasn't even a unified currency. That's really a post-Civil War thing. But these conditions were awful. One of the things that I believe, this may be apocryphal, but I believe there's a quote about the miners talking to socialist organizing from Europe, and the miners going, "We're not even proletarianized."
If the way they had to live their lives was they get, the IWW gets called a hobo union, or other terms like that, because a lot of these workers at the time lived as hobos. You had to take trains to get to your mining camp, and you would arrive there just with your bundle, and you would live at the campsite and be working for the company for however months or however long your job was. And so it wasn't like the way that we think of work, where you live at your home and you wake up and you go to your job. No, they lived at these mining sites with the other miners. And so they had this really communal, collective sort of lifestyle when they were actually on the job. And then when they were between jobs, they had to hop trains and, go from place to place and use, the famous hobo currencies and things like that. So yeah, they were not what we think of.
They basically had to be transient workers, right?
Right.
Which means that they were very hard to organize amongst craft union lines anyway, but they wouldn't have been, even no one would have attempted to. But even what we think of as like modern business unionization, which does come out of industrial unions in some sense, would have been very hard with these workers because they're not in one area. They're all over the place. If they're not hobos, they're in these like company camps that you could easily get kicked out of. And if you're not in company housing, then you're homeless. And so these conditions are pretty bad.
Right. The other part of that is that they had access to dynamite, which, it does play into some of the notorious aspects of the Western miners and the Western Federation of Miners and the IWW, just as far as how militant they were, because, they had this access to explosives and they could really go after, people who wronged them.
Yeah, that's that's important. But we also need to put that in the context of people were often gunning these guys down. Like,
yes, that as well, like massacres.
Yeah. So that's part of why it's I think like we have to keep that in mind when dealing with so many of these massacres, because and why they got so violent is, yeah, these guys had dynamites. They're also, I mean, everybody was armed back then. But there is a real sense in which I think you see here this confrontation at a fever pitch. I mean, people know about, I mean, from Matewan, I mean, like some of these battles involved like not just in Heads, but also eventually the military and bombing. So it was not,
Oh yeah,
were not small affairs. So the IWW got, and the miners union before it, got militant real fast. Like,
right.
They kind of had to.
And yeah, as far as the other labor organizations were concerned, like the AFL or even like the Socialist Party, a lot of the time, they looked at wobblies, which most people know that's what an IWW member is called. They saw them as basically like roughneck, kind of, hard ass shit kickers in one way or another, and basically looked down on them for that. They would call them thugs, and they really didn't recognize them as worthwhile to unionize and to be part of the civilization they were trying to build.
So, what is there a particular instance that has the IWW form? Like, is there a specific event that happens that causes the miners union to form into the IWW?
So the miners union, well, first, so it was the Western Federation of Miners, which wasn't, all over the country, and it was just one industry. They actually, I think, created another organization between them and the IWW, which was the American Labor Federation or something like that, the AL something or other. But it wasn't really that anything happened. It was that uh, they a bunch of these militants and political radicals and socialists got together in 1905, and they decided that they needed to do something about the craft union problem, and they needed to do something to organize not just nationally, but technically, even beyond that. And so you had people like after the late 1800s with the Haymarket Affair and all, and a bunch of other different things that were really making it look like a war, not like in a lot of different ways, like kind of a civil war between workers and the capitalist class. They needed something more. So you had Lucy Parsons, Mother Jones, Daniel De Leon, Big Bill Haywood. He was the Western Miner Federation guy, and a bunch of other things. All these people got together at a Congress in 1905 and decided that they wanted to do something, and that's when they created the IWW.
Now, how far does the IWW go initially? Like, what are its initial successes?
I don't. I'm not exactly sure. I'm more so focused on like the ideology, and what causes these ideological differences. They weren't ever the most populated union. I think in like 1905, they only represented about 50,000 workers.
Yeah, that's
no, that was just the top 5 organizations that joined, but pretty much not more than 100,000 workers.
Which, on one hand, is small. On the other hand, is still larger than most socialist organizations today. So it's, I mean, I think it's still larger than the DSA is, although I think the DSA is hemorrhaging numbers. But socialist organizations over 100,000 are rare. But the IWW is interesting because why is it associated with a particular ideology? Because there's no other branch of American unionism, even like the TUUL and the TUEL, which were the two. The TUUL actually is the successor organization of the TUEL, and those were associated with the Comintern, right? But even those unions, the unions that affiliated with those groups, never had reputations for being purely communist unions because it wasn't required to join them, and the IWW doesn't initially either, but very quickly it seems to be associated with syndicalism. And so, how does that happen?
So, first of all, syndicalism, the word itself just means trade union in France. So, when people say syndicalism, usually they mean revolutionary syndicalism now. But the word itself really just means a trade union. So when you had early people doing the history of the IWW, they would call it a syndicalist organization. Sometimes they meant revolutionary, but sometimes they really just meant this is a trade union. But the thing that causes the IWW to become more ideologically specific is the relationship that it had with not only the Socialist Party, but also the Socialist Labor Party, and the way that these three groups had agreements and disagreements over a few basic topics. The main one being direct action, which the Socialist Party eventually wrote into its constitution that it would not support any group that was for any kind of sabotage, and we'll get to that word in a moment. But basically, they objected to direct action. And then the other major thing is parliamentarism. So the IWW has always been non-parliamentary, but it hasn't always been anti-parliamentary, meaning that you could have an IWW membership and also belong to another organization that's affiliated with a political party, and that's totally fine. But a lot of the disputes over centralization and decentralization go back to wanting the IWW to be more parliamentary in its outlook. But yeah, so the whole thing with syndicalism is even revolutionary syndicalism isn't anarchism. And this is something that also gets equally confused, is that the revolutionary syndicalist outlook is basically that you could use a general strike as a revolutionary device, and expropriating the workplace and running them by the unions is an important piece of that. But anarcho-syndicalism is the modification of that idea that says, and those groups, those syndicates are not going to be subordinated to a party or some other kind of centralized organization. So you could have a revolutionary syndicalist, even a Marxist revolutionary syndicalist like the Council Communists, or on the downside, someone like George Sorel and the National Syndicalists. And this isn't really a development of anarchism or an anarchist idea into a fascist idea or into a Marxist idea. All three of these ideologies are looking at the same real developments within the working class and the revolutionary ideology that came out of it, and then adding their own flavor to it. I don't know if that really answered your question.
I mean,
but
it answers my question to some degree. I mean, one of the things that, like the fine point distinctions between anarcho-syndicalism and like council communism is highly debated amongst anarcho-syndicalists and councilists themselves. But syndicalism, one of the things that people will say, for example, anarcho-syndicalism is a nation organ of fascism, and syndicalism is tied into the early, what we might call left fascist program. Has nothing to do with Hitlerism or anything like that, and that never really manifested in America either. But once you know that syndicate just means union, right, in this context, then national syndicalism's relationship to, say, anarcho-syndicalism becomes very clearly oppositional. Right. Because what they're arguing for is nationally organized syndicates, which are tied to a centralized state and subordinated to that state, which is also actually what the Communist parties ended up doing too in the communist states. So, like, there's the all Chinese labor union or whatever, which they don't ever strike or anything like that. So these developments are, I think, kind of crucial for understanding how syndicalism became manifested in the IWW, because the IWW syndicalism it's just a politicized form of unionism, and the two things that you put out where they break with the Socialist Party is on direct action or saboteurism, or basically property violence, and on subordination to a party. And right. So now, interestingly, the the SPUSA never actually has its own unions ever. So, um, which is very different from, say, the origins of like the socialist parties or the labor parties in Europe, which all come out of unions explicitly. Like the SPD comes out of the All German labor. How do you translate it? I always call it League, but I don't think that's actually the correct translation of the German. But whatever, the LaSalle's group. Um, the obviously British labor comes out of a combination of Chartists and the labor and labor unions in Britain. Um, the it is not that the American Socialist Party had no relationship to unions. That's not true at all. It definitely did, but it did not come out of a coalition of them into a party. It came out of people coming over from Europe with socialist ideas for the most part, and combining that into both the worker end of the populist movement and already nascent labor movements in the United States, like the more radical end of the Knights of Labor, the worker end of the populist movement, particularly people who were disaffected by William Jennings Bryan making deals with the Democrats. So that's how that happens in the U.S., right? But when you look at like the SPA's positions, and I tend to be a defender of the SPA, but they make some really like really milquetoast positions that I think are that ultimately don't end up helping them either. Like they don't win based off this. So right. So the IWW is unwilling to sign up to this program and thus are more radicalized and thus associated with anarchists. And I think the association partly comes from the number of migrant workers, particularly from Italy, who joined the IWW. So, I've talked about this. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not an association out of nowhere. There were also a lot of anarchists in the IWW. But, right. But that is the organization itself, was more diverse at the beginning and became more anarchist over time.
So that, however, kind of leaves us with this thing where, in response to the Socialist Party, on one end, and then we haven't talked about it as much, but there's also the De Leonist and the Socialist Labor Party, which is actually older than the Socialist Party, and the development of a parallel IWW, which was like, we agree with the IWW about everything, except also we're subordinated to the SLP, which is our particular syndicalist version of Marxism that's headed up by Daniel De Leon, which is highly sectarian, extremely sectarian, and because it's so sectarian, has pretty strong growth limits, right? Although I think De Leon actually does start in the IWW proper. It's not like he just set it up separately immediately.
Right. Exactly. The other thing about him, or about the Socialist Labor Party, is they also did start their own labor organization that was a total failure at one point. It was called the Socialist something Alliance, Socialist Labor Alliance, or something. That I have it somewhere. But anyway, yeah, they tried to actually have a party created union, and it was a total flop. But yeah, De Leon was there from the beginning, and one way to look at it is there is a difference between the East Coasters and the East and the West in the IWW. Some of that was industrial differences. The West is where the mines were, where the logging was, all those kind of things. The East is where you had more of your factories and stuff like that. But you also had political differences where the East had more of the doctrinaire socialist orientation, and the West had more of the direct action anarchist orientation.
And, in a kind of unscientific sense, that makes total sense to me because the conditions are so different. Like, there's more institutions in the East and the Midwest and urban areas to kind of believe you can function through, whereas in these Western mining companies, you're on your own. Like, there's not like there's the government exists in these areas, but like kind of barely. So
Right.
it's I mean, it's not the Wild West that we think of, but it's not that removed from that either. So that's important to remember too, as for why there was such an attitudinal difference and why like people would be like, why are these Easterners telling us we can't do direct action? Because out here, if we don't do that, we don't have anything. Like,
yeah, and the direct action worked. I mean, one of the slogans is direct action gets the goods. So I mean, it worked. There's a very pragmatic kind of idea about it. And you know, direct action is sort of like a catch-all word. A lot of the time it's basically any kind of like strike action can be considered direct action, but so can sabotage. And I think this is where we should talk about that word a bit. The word sabotage comes from the word sabot, which are these wooden shoes that the French would wear. And there's a myth that one day a French worker threw his shoe into the gears of a factory or whatever, and as part of a strike, and put a stop to production as part of the strike action. And that's where the word comes from. Is sabotage is kind of any action that interferes with the production process. So that could be working to rule, or it could be doing, doing a property destruction, or it could be, doing even more violent things like assassinations or something like that. But it covers quite a wide range of activities. On the other hand, it will be accused of being anti-democratic. This is also something that Mussolini and the fascists would like about it, is they felt that it was a more pure form of socialism because it was anti-democratic. But the whole notion that something is not democratic simply because you don't sit around and debate it and then come to an agreement is a little bit of in my eyes, a bit of a bias that that I think is held mostly by politicians or people who are used to sitting around and talking about what to do with their money.
so one thing I think that tension goes back to the tensions between Bakunin and Marx and in the First International, although Bakunin also accuses Marx of being anti-democratic because of the way they handle factionalism and accusing Engels of like not delivering, or mistranslating or not delivering all kinds of stuff. You actually were talking to me about that, and we're going to do an episode on the First International, the International Working Men's Association. Partly, interestingly, because I think it parallels some of the problems you see here, is there is a focus in Marxism on centralization, maybe not democratic centralism in the way that we, associate with like Marxist Leninism, but from the beginning, there's a focus on centralization. And there is a focus on some kind of relationship to a state and party, even though early Marxists are anti-statist, they're just not immediately so. And there's a distinction that comes up around like basically direct action as being anti-democratic. That comes up one of the things Marx accuses Bakunin of, and I I'm torn on that because on one hand I agree with you, it's kind of ludicrous to see democracy as being that procedural.
Right.
However, um, I don't want a bunch of terrorists here, like doing whatever they need to do, even within the organization. Which, to be completely honest, the IWW never did. So we don't have it's not like we have to worry about that in this case. So I find it interesting that when we talk about like the important figures of the IWW, Lucy Parsons associated with anarchism, Mother Jones associated kind of with anarchism. That was a little bit looser. Daniel De Leon associated with his particular flavor of syndicalist Marxism. Big Bill Haywood, I just always think of as a radical.
Yeah.
Eugene Debs,
Eugene Debs.
associated with syndicalism and social democracy and Marxism, all three.
Right.
William E. Troutman, I think more of an anarchist. William Z. Foster, who is a syndicalist Marxist Leninist by the end of his life and never renounces syndicalism either. Sees actually the Soviet cancels as kind of a form of syndicalism, but supports Stalin explicitly and joins the CPUSA, which I think a lot of modern people really have trouble understanding. And I see him as kind of a successor to Debs, but he's not in that initial group. So in the beginning, you have all kinds of radicals. I mean, the one thing that you could say that you don't have are liberals. You don't have liberals in the same way that you do even in the CIO. Like, John Lewis is a liberal, for example, in the CIO. He's even associated with the Republican Party, I believe. Although that meant something very different in the 1920s than it does now. I mean, he was associated with the progressive movement in the Republican Party, but still. So you have a bunch of different flavors of radicals, but it seems like the tensions around the Socialist Party, and we talked about the Socialist Labor Party. And one thing that we have to point out about the Socialist Labor Party is the Socialist Labor Party De Leon considered himself the representative of Marxism in America, although totally self-appointed. It wasn't like he was chosen by the First International for that or anything. And while we think of the Socialist Party as Marxist, as kind of reformist Marxist or social democratic, because Victor Berger was a Marxist, Debs was a Marxist, that's kind of wrong. There are tons of tendencies, including tendencies that like Marx and Engels said that you probably should kick out in the SPA from moment one that, we don't talk about because it kind of makes people look bad. I mean, there's even groups that you might even consider proto-fascist in the SPA. They're not a majority. They don't have representation in Congress, but they existed. There are definitely people who would have fallen under the idea of like jingoist socialism. So not quite national socialism in the way we have to talk about post-fascism, but in the armchair socialism of Germany, of like the German historical school, or like what you might call like just jingo socialists, national chauvinists, etc., which Marx complains about, and going all the way back at people who are very weary about racial integration and stuff like that. They're in the Socialist Party. So the Socialist Party is so multi-tendency that you kind of just have to call it reformist, because there are radical groups in the Socialist Party, and Debs is actually one of the more radical members in the Socialist Party. and does become, the leader of the party effectively. But it's a broad tendency group that a lot of the kinds of socialists that are in it today we would probably see as well to the right of the DSA, like, or to maybe even parts of the Democratic Party today. I mean, like, it's a really huge tent organization, and so the Marxist Socialist Labor Party kind of takes their ball and goes home. Like we mentioned, De Leon founds his own parallel IWW. It's just like, we're going to have an industrial workers of the world, but it's ours. And also we're not going to make that clear that it's even different. So like I don't even think, it wasn't like it was denoted as a different organization. It was just,
nope. It was same name, I think the same symbols, everything.
So that's fun. And then we've already mentioned that there's an increasing separation between the SPA and the IWW, even though Debs is associated with both.
Well, eventually Debs also lost his seat at the executive whatever of the Socialist Party. That was part of the one of the straws that totally broke the camel's back.
So one of the things that you pointed out, so the IWW of the East tended to be socialist. A lot of them get associated later on. A lot of them become like associated with the TUEL and the TUUL, which is when the Communist Party exists and they try to do the same thing, basically. Out west, there's a lot more anarchists, and I told you, like, organically that makes a lot of sense to me. Also, there's already pre-existing tradition coming out of Mexico of various kinds of anarcho-socialism from the Mexican Revolution, which I've never been able to prove had an influence on these ideas, but it feels like they must have, because they were in close, like, geographic proximity. And they definitely that's from newspapers and whatnot.
It's always tough to figure that out because so many anarchists went to Latin America and were able to develop anarchist, lively anarchist movements there, totally separate from the English speaking world. So yeah, like in the Mexican Revolution, you had two different anarcho-syndicalist groups and the Zapatistas. Or like you had a anarcho-syndicalist, anarcho-communist, and Zapatistas. And not necessarily always agreeing with each other.
I was about to say, the anarcho-syndicalists are the people who betrayed the Zapatistas to the center.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, the Magones.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really crazy to think about from our perspective today that, like, you would have that kind of a betrayal against, basically kind of like the mascots of the 90s anti-globalization movement, the Zapatista, the EZLN.
Although the EZLN in and of itself actually probably has more of a Magonist ideology than it does an actual Zapata, because the conditions are different. And the other irony to this, and I did a whole show on this already, so people can go back and check that out. It's with Kyle and John Michael from Strange Matters magazine, but the irony there also being that a lot of the reforms the Zapatistas wanted as far as land reform, they got, and the Magones didn't get shit. So like, it's the whole thing's just, whenever you're like, oh, you're like, oh, it's the Bolsheviks betrayed people. Every one of these revolutions ends up being a mess.
Yep.
but nonetheless, so I feel like, like I said, I've never been able to prove it. I mean, I know later on that Magon has some influence on later IWW people directly. One of the Magon brothers, but in general, it feels like there's also just more anarchists out and about. I mean, what's interesting about that, and I didn't warn you about this. I don't expect you to know much about it, but like, there's a weird parallel with the communist movement in China, which starts off as highly anarchist because Marxists don't have a whole lot to say about peasants,
Mhm.
and becomes more and more Marxist. But there's a weird strain of like, there's some things that Maoists do that if you understand the history of anarchism, you're like, oh, that actually is closer to anarchist ideologies. Um, Particularly some of the focus on empowering the peasantry and stuff of the East Indian Cultural Revolution, which I'm going to have Marxist Leninists really mad that I said that. But
Well,
it's also true. Like, we know this from Mao's biography that he read anarchist texts
yeah,
way before he read Marxist texts because they
I
were
think
more
he was
readily
even
available.
in an anarchist group. Like, I don't even think it was his reading alone. But yeah,
Yeah, he was involved with the anarchist organizations when he was in university, and also, I mean, he was organizing peasants. Um, uh, that so those conditions, like, when it also makes sense just from the standpoint of which industries that we talked about the Wild West part of it, but let's talk about the industry parts of it. East, there's industry. That's where the
right.
factories are.
Manufacturing, right.
Yeah, there is not a
Um,
lot of manufacturing in the West.
what also, I mean, I don't know how we have gotten this far without mentioning it, but they did try to be an international organization as well, the IWW.
Oh yeah,
Now, they had Argentina, Australia, Canada, Chile, China, Ecuador, Fiji, Germany, Ireland, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Peru, on and on. South Africa, United Kingdom. There was actually like IWW attempts there as those places, as that particular organization. Of course, much more was happening the closer you get to the United States. But they tried to be an international organization, the whole of the world part of industrial workers of the world.
I mean, and this brings us to the Italian question. And one of the things I always point out that's interesting, the more I learned about and maybe we could, this is for another time, but it's come up with other guests of mine, PH Higgins and I talked about it all way back in the early episodes of the show, on autonomia, but that Italian Marxism actually comes from the anarchist side of the International Working Men's Association split, almost to a person. So like, so and that, I think, really influences the IWW because we cannot downplay in the East, in particular, but in general, how many, how these connections were made was that a lot of these socialists were immigrants, recent immigrants
Oh yeah.
themselves, and a lot of them were from 1848 and also Italian unification,
Mm-hmm.
which means you had a ton of socialists and anarchists coming out of these national movements that got suppressed, and coming in right after the Civil War, and being in the Italian case, being a free flowing Eastern labor force for cheap labor, up into the 1940s. So that really establishes that. And I think there is here, I think we have much more documentary evidence that there's a lot of influence from these Italian Marxists and anarchists on the IWW, and particularly the forms that it takes. So I think there's that. But this gets us to the question, now we've established this, that this wasn't just about how this is established, but it's important, we talk about the first anti-communist movement.
Right.
It did not go under the name of, the first Red Scare wasn't freaking people out about Bolsheviks. That hadn't even happened yet.
Right.
It wasn't the whole liberal debate about what to do with the Russian Revolution again hadn't happened yet. Although that does happen in the context of the growth of the IWW, kind of in the middle. But kind of, we'll get to this eventually, is part of what ends, the IDW's heyday. But during this time period, when we were talking about anti-communists, they were often complaining about anarchists. I mean,
right. And
go ahead.
And even in that time, anarchists would consider themselves to be Reds, and they considered the red flag to be the symbol of war, not necessarily the symbol of communism. It was seen as a symbol of aggression. So even anarchists would talk about raising the red flag, and of it being a symbol that anarchists would use.
I mean, it's interesting how this color coordination happens, because this also goes all the way back to piracy. Because I'm like, red flags and with pirates means that you're dead, as opposed to a black flag, which means they might take quarter, so they might keep you for ransom. But the reason why the red flag was what it was, and it was associated with socialism because it was a war flag, and it was a war flag because it was literally symbolizing them bathing the white flag in blood.
Right.
That's what it meant. So yeah, that's it. Being strictly limited to socialists seems to be a post breakdown of the First International thing.
Well, I guess, when we call it the Red Scare, I guess I'm just saying it's not inappropriate for Red to be inclusive of anarchists.
I don't think the division between Marxists and anarchists is, even after the crack of the First International, is actually very strong until I actually believe the double whammy of the Mexican Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, they both happen around the same time, is really what solidifies the split, both in the United States and internationally. But it was weaker. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned with William C. Foster, even late, like syndicalism as being seen as opposed to Bolshevism, at least from someone like Foster's point of view, is unnecessary. Like, he thinks that you can have both. And when we talk about the origins of syndicalism as opposed to anarcho-syndicalism, but there's a strong sort of, even in Foster's vision, there's a strong sort of, yes, there's a Politburo, yes, we have Uncle Joe. I don't know how much he's aware of the purges and whatnot, but there's a strong sense of like, but we have the Soviets, and we could have syndicates here, and he kind of doesn't make a strong distinction between syndicates and councils and Soviets and all that in his mind. Right. And like we mentioned earlier, that goes all the way back to Debs. Debs also thought that there was no real tension here. Like he had a program that anarcho-syndicalists could sign up to. And that, we haven't seen that like ever since then. So
yeah. I mean, a lot of these distinctions come out of decisions that are made within organizations, right?
Right.
So like, even if you go back to the First International, the Proudhonists, within the Proudhonist section, there is a division over whether or not to collectivize land. And the ones in favor of collectivizing land became collectivist Proudhonists, who then also were in agreement with the Bakuinists. And anyway, so it's like these kind of proposals and what side you take on them in these very constrained contexts give rise to these divisions that we often totally forget that that's where their origins are. Is
some of these
not
are interpersonal debates, are factional debates. They're not. They become ideological debates. Like how big of a difference is there between Bakunin and Marx? Well, they're big by the end of their debates. They're huge. Similar with I think the more defining, I mean, we always talk about the Bakunin split because it's like, the big thing between Marxist and anarchist, but the splits that are actually more defining for what Marxism is are actually debates between Marx and Blanquist in France, which is where the dictatorship of the proletariat comes from and what that means in Marx versus what it means in Blanqui. It's debates over, can you have non-workers in your movement? Marx says yes, obviously for obvious reasons. Certain Blanquists say no. And then there's the debates with the Lassalleans who thought they were Marxist. Like, that's the thing. Like, even though they were fighting with Marx himself, the Lassalleans thought they were Marxist, and Marx suppressed his criticism of the Lassalleans for organizations to develop, although he also didn't allow his faction to join in the all German labor league or whatever until what would become the SPD until basically Lassalle was dead. And it kind of happens at Goethe, and it really doesn't like take hard until Erfurt. But switch back to America, because that's what we're talking about. The IWW is actually trying to be international. It is political, and it gets suppressed hard. I mean, like, if you're thinking about the group that gets hit the hardest by pre-1917 Red Scares, it's the IWW.
Let me just go through this list of different ways that not different instances of suppression, but different types.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you had employers, particularly the Phelps Dodge Corporation, which owned a string of copper mines in Arizona. They were trying to suppress the Wobblies. So employer organizations, this could also be something like the auto manufacturers and stuff like that. You had the military got in on anti-WW stuff, where the War Department claimed that, during hostilities with the soldiers, they would get involved. You had the Justice Department. You had, and then you had all of these patriot groups that were led by the Bureau of Investigation. They acted as an auxiliary. You had Congress. And then you had some specific laws, the Espionage Act. Then you had what were called the criminal syndicalist laws that were in like 20 or 30 states or something. And then on top of all of that official, like, above ground, totally public attacks on the IWW, you had vigilante groups doing terrorist campaigns, lynching, tarring and feathering, smashing up offices and labor halls, and just getting in like very combative situations with Wobblies. Those are the types.
I think people don't even know that the Espionage Act was specifically named at the IWW.
Yep.
Yeah, the instances and the number of dead are actually a little bit shocking. I mean, in some cases, it was almost like a low-key, like, not a civil war, but like Days of Lead, but with unions. And yet you had these paramilitary groups. You had it. You had these anti-anarchist sentiment being promoted, particularly after McKinley dies. The the amount here is pretty staggering. And I think by 19, I think you sent me notes on this, and you found out that by 1933 there was something like 700 convictions for criminal
Right.
syndicalism.
Right. And those were just that one kind of law. Then the Espionage Act, they were actually deporting people to the Soviet Union. They would load up anyone foreign with a socialist or anarchist orientation. They would literally ship them to the Soviet Union. And that happened famously to Emma Goldman and Alex Berkman. But yeah, so just like those two things alone, and then all of the other ways in which they would go after the IWW, we haven't even gotten to the free speech stuff, or like the way that their anti-war activities became another way of attacking them. But even outside of like their strike activity, one of the largest campaigns they went on were their free speech campaigns.
Yeah, I think that would surprise people that the IWW actually became as associated for free speech campaigns as they were associated with radical strike activities. And how did that start?
I don't know how it started, but I know what they would do about it is they would, like, their central like whatever general labor, whatever their board or whatever, would basically just put out a call to all the locals or anyone who is quote unquote footloose, and tell them, hey, this is where a free speech thing is happening. And they would go down there and they would get arrested in mass, and clog up the jails. And, we saw this kind of tactic in the 60s, but the Wobblies were doing this back in like the early 1900s. And these campaigns could last anywhere from a few days to months at a time, where they would go and get consistently arrested and just drive the administration fucking insane trying to figure out how to deal with all of them. And this was all like, because, during this time, people were, you could say stuff that was barely radical at all. And, different cities would try to arrest you.
Yeah. It's I think a lot of people don't know that, like, basically, even though the 13th and 14th Amendment extends the Bill of Rights to states, which prior to that, by the way, they didn't, that they didn't really enforce that until the 50s, really.
Right.
So you have all these states with blatantly unconstitutional laws, and pretty much it was designed in a way where no one had standing to challenge them, and thus get them deemed unconstitutional. That seems familiar. But yeah, I think this is the reason why they fought for free speech is, like, is because they were being prohibited from organizing because of speech codes. I mean, like, it was.
Well, yeah, and one of the main things they would do is they would soapbox. You know, they would go and, you know, this is how they would organize. There was a lot of word of mouth. It's not like they were putting ads in the newspaper or something.
No. So you have that. You have these vigilante groups, the Knights of Liberty, which were interestingly kind of the Black Widow version of the Klan. And that's also being a reactionary group and calling yourself of liberty, ironically, seems to be something that's like constant throughout U.S. history.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, so you have attacks from Knights of Liberty. Did the IWW get attacked by the Klan at all?
Yeah, I don't know the exact incidents, but yeah, they were. But I think like more specialized vigilante groups were formed to attack them.
I mean, and that's not just given that like half of the Pinkertons' bread and butter was just fighting the fucking IWW. Like,
right.
So you have all this. We have hundreds of dead. That doesn't even get us to. I mean, things really intensify after 1917, and then during the anti-war activist stuff. So both the beginnings of an anti-Bolshevik Red Scare and a fear of the Mexican Revolution happening simultaneously, and also all these sedition laws being passed during World War One by Wilson, you know, really led to the IWW getting hit really hard during the Palmer raids. Like, I mean, we talk about the Palmer raids, people know about the Palmer raids, but like, this is where J. Edgar Hoover comes from. Like,
right. And the FBI. Yeah.
And so we had 700 convictions on anti-syndicalist laws, but then there's like something like 10,000 people arrested during the Palmer raids.
Yep. And 556 foreign citizens were deported.
So in an organization of 100,000 people, I just want to point that out. This is a lot.
Like, right. Well, so even before the Palmer raids themselves, the Bureau of Investigation was being used to attack the IWW. So, yeah, it was definitely oriented towards putting down the IWW because that's what they were doing even before Palmer's raids.
So, a lot of the stuff that you see. One of the interesting things about, say, McCarthyism, I think McCarthyism affected a larger number of people, but it was a colder fight. And I know it doesn't seem like that because that's the one we know and is documented. But like, and it's awful. I don't want to downplay the 50s Red Scare at all. I mean, it was thorough throughout society. And it's not that it doesn't have a body count either. But the early 20th, late 19th century anti-red stuff was more explicitly violent. I mean, it was there was a lot more warring gunfights and stuff. And to be fair, it was mostly aimed at people around the labor movement, particularly IWW. But I mean, there were gunfights between the populist movement and the police too, even when the populist movement was in charge of, like, there were times when the populists would win state elections and like the local Democrats wouldn't let them be seated and they would come back with guns. Man. So like I think people underestimate how fucking crazy the late 19th, early 20th century was. But there's a real sense that like there's a lot of real fear, and and basically and we're going to talk about the decline of the IWW because it begins as a much more massive group after this time period. After the 1920s, basically, you start seeing a decline. By the time you get to the 1940s, the IWW is pretty small. By the time you get to the second half of the 20th century, it's in that weird sectarian number limit that I don't really understand why this is the number limit. But if you're a sectarian group that collapses, or if you're a sectarian group that never has a mass period, you tend to cap out between 3,000 and 5,000 people, which is like where the IWW has been for most of the 20th century after this time period. In the United States, I don't know. I think its international membership is still larger than that, but it's that's roughly where it is in so much that we have numbers. This is a huge movement in the early 20th century. 100,000 people, even though we mentioned is fairly small. Yes, the Socialist Party has a significantly more support base than that, but until the CIO, I don't think there is a union movement that has, outside of the AFL, that has that number. Actually, I don't know.
We gotta also, put that in perspective. That the way the numbers work is that, unlike a political party, these are not, people go in and out of the IWW or groups like it. The turnover is really high.
Yeah.
So if you are counting, if you have year after year after year of like 100,000 members, or it's not even members, it's people whose dues have not lapsed, right? So if you have year after year after year of this is how many people are still paying their dues, and there's a high turnover rate, that is a much bigger portion of the population than you're counting in any one specific year that are coming into contact with and actively participating in what is basically an anarchist movement.
So, interestingly, despite all this government suppression, you and I are both of the opinion that the IWW's heyday does not end because of government suppression. In fact, if anything, the government suppression maybe makes it slightly more popular. The so one of the favorite ironies of American history is like if you go send cops to beat those people, that's going to probably become a mass movement very quickly. That's a tendency in American history. But what do you think? I think the Palmer raids do hurt the IWW pretty significantly. But then the Debs campaign, Debs prison run kind of collapses, right? Like, the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and I was telling you after this, I think the 20 conditions that are attached to the program that are conditions during the Comintern, which require a whole lot of purging and a lot of ideological litmus tests, which beyond what you would need to sign on to their program, because I think actually Debs would have been willing to sign on to the 1918 Bolshevik program. And I think a lot of anarchists wouldn't even have a problem. If you go read like the ABCs of Communism, which is the old Bolshevik program, it's I think people are actually surprised by how left wing it is.
Well, this is something I was about to say is, Emma Goldman didn't even publish her disillusionment with Russia until 1923 or something like that. The enthusiasm for the Bolsheviks after they won among anarchists was fairly high for quite some time. It took a lot of firsthand accounts from bona fide anarchists to convince other anarchists that something had really gone terribly wrong there. Part of that is because the Bolsheviks very effectively painted a victorious picture of themselves and their accomplishments. There wasn't any real reason for anarchists to doubt that as far as they were concerned. So,
I think,
but
yeah, I mean,
but that a lot of anarchists defected to the Communist Party here, or became Bolsheviks in Russia, stuff like that. And I think ultimately that is where revolutionary mojo was transferred over to.
well, I mean, because part of that I think has to do with the fact that the Mexican Revolution was so fucking unclear on like, did the good guys win? We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and the Bolsheviks were clear winners in 1917. There was a lot of enthusiasm. They did a lot of good outreach, actually, even to the United States. Although the response to them, I mean, you have this defection to the Communist Party, particularly early on. You also have a lot of these organizations split to, there's, like Zinoviev, for example, like hangs out who's going to be the recognized party in the Third International for a long time, before the CPUSA is formed. And then actually breaks up a lot of these organizations. And that begins the long decline of the SPA, which, died slowly over 50 years. And the IWW didn't die, but it dropped back dramatically. And one of the things I think that it did, and you might disagree with me on this, is its image as a anarchist organization primarily, I think, comes from the fact that, like, if you were open to something else, you left. And I also think that it doesn't help that, like, from like 1950 to like 2000 and something, the IWW seemed like a historical reenactment society. like,
Yeah,
I
I think for most people, most like potentially radical workers in general, throughout what would be considered like the beginning of anarchism, all the way through till like the 30s, I don't think they really always gave a shit about some of the finer details of the differences between a communist and an anarchist. A lot of these membership numbers represent just what the dominant organization was in a territory. If we look at Spain or we look at Russia or whatever, it's not like what the numbers tell me is more like that is the church that you went to because that is the church in the area, more than like you really had a lot to choose from and some people went here, some people went there. I think you had to be pretty ideologically minded in order to go against the popular form of revolutionary socialism in your area, right? So, and then the other, like, just anarchism itself, they didn't even call themselves anarchists until like the 1870, 1880, like well after the First International. And they, like, as far as defining what their positions were against communists, I mean, that took like real world experiences to really, I think, make people aware of how those differences played out.
I was about to say, so much of this is actually post 1917, pre 1992, right? And a lot of our experience of this, and let's be honest, our experiences of socialism at our age cohort, right, in particular, is that it's a weird lifestyle group, frankly. that exists around campuses and that had some relationship to the New Left. And that may or may not have been mass. We don't know because, we're not the right age cohort again. And that they lost somehow. Yes, I can define all this now, but I'm just coming at how we came up with this. When I encountered radicalism in my teens, it was almost always anarchist or Trotskyist. That was like the only thing you could find in America at the time. There were probably like, if you knew about the CPUSA, you made jokes about him being an adjunct of the Democratic Party, even as early as the 1990s. Like it was a thing. And also anarchism now, I think, comes out of a post debates in the 1970s and 1990s between the municipalist anarchist and the primitivist anarchist and all these kind of quote post left are post Bolshevik, depending on where you're coming from, forms of anarchism that were popular amongst basically Gen Xers. And by popular, I mean we're subcultural groups. I have to remind people, and I do this sincerely, when they're complaining about anarchists now, they're probably not actually complaining about people with a strong understanding of the tradition in which we're talking about.
Right.
Like, and I think you're right. The distinction between Marxist and anarchist was an ongoing thing that was clarified over the course of about 100 years. And some of that, a lot of that I side with the Marxists, not all of it. And the other thing that you have with anarchism now that makes it a little bit more opaque is that there are a lot of different tendencies that become anarchistic, some of which are historically completely unrelated to the ones we're talking about. And so there is that as well. Like the syndicalist and the anarcho-communist or the anarcho-collectivist, like those groups are clearly tied into the red faction. To some degree, even like American anarcho-individualists are, depending on which ones you're talking about.
They're way more like, they're weird though.
Yeah. Yes, they're
a little exceptional. But like Stirner wasn't even read by anarchists until this guy McKay like republished him way later. Like the reason anarchists read him today is because an American individualist anarchist like republished them. And
and basically
like
just
kind of anachronistically
basically despite Marxist, and also to create an individualist tradition in Europe that didn't really exist, right?
Right.
I mean, there is an individualist anarchist tradition in Europe, but it mostly comes out of Italy. It doesn't actually come out of
and what like my team of anarchists would call it is like the illegalist tradition,
right? I think I have often, like, there's a lot, in my audience, there's a lot of expressed contempt for anarchism. I don't share it, even though I don't think you would consider me an anarchist. My opinions on the state are very close to Marxist in that, like, I don't think you can immediately get rid of it. However, I actually do see a lot of the critiques anarchists made about there's this game Marxists play a lot where they're constantly shifting their goals. Like, okay, one that I've noticed recently is like, oh, we need more and more developmentalism, and they'll cite Engels, and then I'm like, hey, but that passage you cite in Engels, if you read the next paragraph and the paragraph before it, he's actually saying that we've met the developmental needs for communism in 1880.
Yeah.
So what do you mean? Like, and So I'm like, why is the goal always shifting? Why is this all, why is this, why is the amount of productive, oh, it's from real life experience. I'm like, okay, whatever. You're shifting the goalpost. Like, and that's a real problem. Um, Conversely, uh, I kind of agree with you that uh, anarchist sectarians tend to have extreme positions because they also tend to not have any relationship to power whatsoever. So it's an easier position to take, and that's not historically true. Like syndicalists and even anarcho-syndicalists, even if they had a strong distrust of bureaucracy, etc., um, they were not as idealistic as some people are today around like we can't have any hierarchy, and by hierarchy
Right.
we mean
Like,
fuck you, Dad.
like all these old anarchist organizations, they did everything by voting,
Right.
right? Now anarchists want to say that voting as a process itself is something that anarchists are against. Totally anachronistic. That is not, I mean, it is, anarchism today has become so much more like of virtue ethics than the sort of pragmatic development out of working class struggle that it began as. I mean, it really, like, Proudhon, his ideas about mutualism came from people who called themselves mutualists in France, in Lyon. He didn't come up with that shit.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, the collectivists didn't come up with, like, Bakunin. Bakunin didn't come up with that shit. That was what workers and workers' organizations already wanted to do and were already doing. And this is the case with a lot of different anarchist positions originally, is the anarchist idea wasn't so much philosophical as it was just a practical idea of why are we going to let politicians mediate or represent us when they're not getting anything done. It was a really simple, like like common sense kind of distrust, where if you were a militant worker and, like, your socialist politician was making all these promises, but you're not seeing results on the ground, how many times does that have to happen before you become an anarchist?
Yeah, and there was no like Marxist Leninism for people to go to either. The one thing that I think a point that you made here about why so many anarchists became communist, and it wasn't about, I mean, it was ideological in that they were all radicals, but it wasn't so much about like the clear, like they weren't having like come to Jesus moments on the road to Moscow, about the transcendent truth of democratic centralism. It was more, these are the people I work with, these are the people I trust. This is we know these are radicals. Okay, they have some history of success in Russia. I don't understand all that, but I know that that people I trust do. Here's where we're going. And
Right.
that happens with living real movements that have the potential or are becoming partially mass. Whereas sectarian divisions being hardened and rigid, and I think this is true for Marxists too. So people don't think I'm chastising anarchists for this. In fact, that actually Marxists in some ways have become worse. That tends to come from failure, and that tends to come from like there is no tradition for you to belong to in the same way, and so you can hold it invariantly as a remnant. because there is no living tradition for which you really belong. There's no one actively doing something. And so like the IWW, for example, became a little bit more broad based again. And this is beyond the scope of our discussion today, but I saw it become more broad based again, and like less hostile to Marxist and stuff again, pretty explicitly in the 2010s and the late aughts, because they started actually doing stuff again. And I mean, like prison unionization and actually succeeding there, small shop unionizations, and actually, I mean, like, yeah, in very blue areas of the country and stuff like that, it's like in Portland and Seattle and whatnot. But still, they did it, and there's stuff happening, and then it becomes a less sectarian organization.
But post 68 Marxism after 1968, you know, after the situationists or after autonomists or whatever, are a lot more tolerable for an anarchist to begin with too. So
I mean, that's interesting though, because well, I've talked to you about this. Like, autonomists are interesting because they're both amenable to anarchists, but also autonomists come out of Marxist-Leninism, which I think is not really well understood.
Well, there's two kinds,
right?
There's
a bunch of kinds, but yeah, go ahead.
There's the ones that are like, I think in Germany there's something called autonomy, which people get confused with autonomous Marxists, but it was its own kind of movement in the 70s.
Yeah.
But yeah, but then there's the autonomous Marxists as well,
and there's councilist, and there's but even Marxist-Leninist, honestly, you were talking about the history with Mao, like their relationship to anarchists has fluctuated dramatically at different time periods, even in their sectarian groups. And right now, that's pretty precipitously anti-anarchist. And you know what I think that's about, and we're off topic, but I think that's about people dealing with their primary disillusionment with Occupy, and then the reason why a lot of people have become more Marxist-Leninist has not because they understand the mortal science of Marxist-Leninism, or even consistent propagators of Mao, Deng, and Stalin, because when I quote, they don't even often understand what time period of Stalin's work they're pulling from, and they're like quoting 1951 Stalin, but maintaining 1932 Stalin positions, and then trying to equate them with positions held by Deng, which literally makes no sense. Which tells me that what's going on there, and I know in some cases, yes, people are well thought out sectarians, but in a lot of cases, this is responding to failures in the same way that we talked about, well, you would join the church. Well, okay, but you've all been traumatized also by this big event that had failed. Like 1968 is one of them. Occupy is another. The DSA right now is another one. And so I think, and Marxists are often given to like not actually considering even mass psychological motivations for people. They tend to, there's this wild shifts often in the same person between hyper voluntarism and then like hyper determinism that's totally incompatible with each other, that I often see with Marxists.
A baby Marxist and a baby anarchist tend to have very different impulses. Like, the impulse of a baby Marxist is to be a system thinker, to imagine what the system is that is the good system that we should all fight for. The baby anarchist is a contrarian and someone who really impulsively tends to rebel against any kind of system.
Yeah.
And over time, each has to deal with the other aspects of reality and come to terms with them. But
I think that's fair. Um, I also think, with the, so in my completely unscientific and unfair stereotypical way of talking about the way this happens with these two groups of people, you talked about this with like the average Marxist is a systems thinker and a fucking ideology nerd. The average anarchist is a fly by your hip anti-authoritarian who also who somehow doesn't end up right wing. That's an important caveat, because that tendency also is the fuck you dad tendency is strong amongst reactionaries too.
Yeah, it's true.
But nonetheless, both has to come up with fundamental failures, the contrarianness. But I also think it's partly like which one's dominant. It's partly like based on the most recent failure. So yeah.
Oh, there's that, and I really think there's something about who's doing better youth outreach at the time.
Well,
I know I was the subject of some very well put together anarchist youth outreach when I was growing up.
Zine culture was very anarchistic, and I come out of zine culture, so like I feel like I knew yeah, go ahead.
Zine culture, and also even infoshop.org had a youth section. Also, anarchists were the only people I could find that would say anything negative about the school system. And that combo, to me, I was like, that's my people. They don't like school for the same reasons I don't. They like to party. They like adventure. They're not just trying to achieve status, all these kind of things.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about that. I was like, coming out of zine culture, it was that stuff is why I didn't like anarchists. Because they're like, I mean, I'm not against partying, but I'm like, y'all are some undisciplined motherfuckers. And in my experience of the battles of Seattle, which is where I dealt with Trotskyists and anarchists and International Answer, I've talked about this before. I mean, it was my first. I went out there as a working class kid. I actually worked and saved up money to go. I was 18 years old, and I encountered a bunch of anarchists and a bunch of Trotskyists and like a bunch of people who would later on become Stalinists, but were not yet because the WWP was there. And also Pat Buchanan and all this libertarian stuff. And I encountered at the Battle for Seattle. And I just remember people declaring victory and me going, what the fuck did you think you won? Like, yeah. And that led to this conservatizing reaction of me. However, I have dealt with Marxists long enough to see the systems theory. And then there's another kind of fuck you dadism that Marxists have right now, which is basically violent revenge fantasies.
Yeah, that's
which at different periods have been associated with anarchists, but like and so I kind of think what that is, and the fact that we can talk about this as personality types and lifestyles is because we are kind of removed from these being mass movements, although at times they have come close. Right. The end of the 1990s, it did really feel like the anarchism was on the horizon. It was interesting. I remember someone complaining. This was so fucking funny, actually. Oh, the Marxist tradition in the United States had been succumbed by recent interviews of anarchists in 2019, and I was like, "You idiot! You like you clearly don't know the American socialist milieu post and you left." After the great exodus of the anti-revisionists, and where they all just became, I don't know. Actually, that's a whole nother question. What happened to all the anti-revisionists in the 70s? Did they just all become like Jesus freaks or whatever? Like, yeah, they became normies, but what kind of normies? We don't know. Yeah. No one fucking studied them.
Well, the other really intelligent thing that anarchists used to do that Marxists are doing more now. Actually, you're one of these people doing it now, but I'll tell you what it is anarchists used to look at like what were the most advanced technological things happening, like Linux, open source software, um, uh, decentralized production, 3D printing. Anarchists would talk a lot about this stuff and say, look, these are reasons we could have autonomous communes or whatever. Now, not so much. Most anarchists are like, you know, more towards the primitivist end,
Are
as
there
far as I could
Chomsky,
tell. Or that, yeah.
which means
Whereas
effectively Democrats. So
whereas you have people like you, Marxists, who are looking at systems theory or mod MMT or like the stuff that's cutting edge now. And even though both those things aren't new, but
no, not remotely. But yeah,
like you're not dealing with dinosaurs all the time.
no, well, this is interesting actually, because I do feel when I came into Marxism in the mid-aughts, before Occupy, before like right before the Great Recession, I predate it when I became like my transition to Marxism really kind of started around 2005, and it actually came out of trying to play through paleo conservative and libertarian ideas consistently, believe it or not, and then like hitting a wall and being like, no, I know too much about the origins of property to believe this shit. Okay, well, and I also I actually have become more skeptical of economics in general, including MMT, including Marxism, than I used to be, because. But I initially I was like, I got hit. Well, neoclassical economics didn't make any fucking sense to me, even though I studied it. And Austrian economics, when people talk about like, oh, Marxism is not rigorous historical materialism and dialectical materialism is bullshit. And I'm like, have you heard about praxology? Like, because you want to talk about like bullshit, like,
right.
And so I reject. I end up rejecting that stuff, and then I do think there was this core of exposure from being a working class kid who was also in the punk scene, and the punk rock scene, and it was kind of bizarre because I think like its politics were both highly like anarcho-communist and also highly fucking reactionary, like at the same time, often, sometimes in the same people.
Where were you at? Because that's how it was here too.
Oh, and I was in Georgia.
Okay. Phoenix can be that way. Very reactionary too.
Yeah. And you met like Trotskyists in college and you thought they were nerds.
Yeah.
That was my, or you met like International Answer. Okay. In the anti-war protest. And I was like, these people are insane.
Well, so what is the materialist analysis of this to me is, the thing you had to do as a punk rocker was you had to create your own albums a lot of the time. You had to record them yourself. You had to print them yourself. You had to start your own label. It's hard to get a politics out of that would support something like the recording industry, right? So I think there is like a real practical reason why anarchism is appealing to punk rockers, because it's pitted against the recording industry and what could be considered commercial viability, the market. All of these things are not helpful for any kind of punk. Mm-hmm. Like you're not going to be able to live off of like a consumer society buying your records. It's just never going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that as a person who perpetually, like, the idea that you would make money from art didn't even occur to me till I was like 20. like because
Yeah.
all you ever did was lose money, and it was something that it's hard to justify doing, particularly as like I was working class, like and like I mean that in both senses of the term. I mean it in a technical term, which most people are, but I also mean it in like if you look at American demographic statistics, we were right at the Pell Grant line, with 4 kids,
yeah.
massive medical debt, and my mother didn't get a college degree until I was 19, and my stepdad was a mechanic. Like, um, and so I don't come from abject poverty. At least not by the time I was a teenager. Although, I mean, I've been homeless as a child and lived in a car for a couple months with my mom. So I do know what that's like. Uh, my experience of radicals, though, and in the punk scene was of that like nascent, what we now call PMC, a category I don't love and don't like to use, but whatever. Of like, okay, well, these are like downwardly mobile, upper middle
Mm-hmm.
class kids. And my experience of them in politics was that I like to use their money to fund my art. So,
Well, and I'm from like the more working class orientation of punk as well. My family background, it's always hard for me to put a finger on it, but single mother, townhouse, Pal Grant is how I took some college classes. So I think that puts me pretty squarely in the middle class.
Yeah,
Working class.
The working, yeah, to get like really sociologically technical here, I would say you are the working lower middle class.
Right.
Yeah. You are well above the poverty line. Although remember, the poverty line in America is like ridiculously fucking low.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
And I do believe unchanged technically since like the 80s, which is kind of crazy to think about, but because I feel like I've been told the poverty line was like under $20,000 a year like my entire life, and I'm just like,
yeah,
money is worth so much less now. So how is that the case? But anyway,
oh yeah. So the type of, but I was listening to like Oi and street punk, and anyone who is into politics was considered a politician and like a middle class kid or suburban punk or something. So that whole it was even to be political at all, let alone what kind, was considered, a bit college.
It's interesting. I think about that too because it's hard to put myself back in like my teenage years. I knew about like the Clash and Crass and all these like political but commercial punk bands and new wave bands. I actually went through the library and tried to get all the books from the fucking Rage Against the Machine. Their second album, which has like there's a back picture of all these books, including Christopher Lash. That's how I encountered Christopher Lash the first time. I didn't realize this until I was thinking about it once. But also like I read like the Black Panthers and all this. This was part of like zine culture. So, and I didn't have the money for these books, so I would go and get them from the library, which I'm sure got me on some fucking list. But although it is pre 9/11, so maybe not. So we would read these, and I couldn't make heads nor tail out of a lot of them. I'm not gonna lie. Like like a 17-year-old reading Marxist theory before the internet is readily available. Like, yes, it exists, but I have to go to the school library to access it at any speed worth doing. And remember, this is at a time period. Also, it takes like 25 minutes to download a picture. Like, so different internet. So and then this time period, it was in the milieu, and honestly, this is going to sound crazy, but I think I was almost as exposed to some of these ideologies from the punk scene and then from the role playing scene, because they were all like because in this time period, the dominant role playing game is not Magic the Gathering. That's not a role playing game anyway, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons, which is what I was trying to pull up. It was Vampire the Masquerade, and radical political ideologies are in that game.
Right, you have the goth punk spectrum for your character in Vampire.
Right, and so like there's a whole like vampire clan that has like Marxist and anarchist in it. And so I got exposed to some of these ideas through that too. But when I encountered them as a very young adult, in like gutter punk community, which actually landed me for being homeless a little while, and then in like really homeless. I was kind of homeless the last 2 years of my teens anyway, but I stayed with friends or whatever, but like street homeless. And then, right before that, the Battle for Seattle stuff, which I went for zine reasons, which is an interesting thing to think about. And I rejected that shit hard by that time, but it's also interesting because I think I was still part of that like I was not coming to it from my parents were kind of apolitical. I mean, they're working class people, like their politics were incoherent, frankly. My mom was like a food dog dealer crap. My dad was like pro death penalty, but also pro socialized medicine, like that's in the 90s. So like, yeah. And by dad, I mean my stepfather, and my actual father is a con man. So I don't know if he has politics. So there was this milieu is really interesting to me. When I encountered it in college, like in Georgia, the college Democrats were still a relatively radical idea. I mean, like at a university, and this is hard to think about now, and people like think about where we were at the end of the 90s, and they don't realize how reactionary a decade that was. But when like Greg Palast, no, it was not even Greg Palast. It was the guy who
like a truther guy,
kinda. Trutherism was, but this is pre-truther. So this is like after 9/11, but before. Greg Palast was more of a the 2004 election was stolen guy. But this is before that.
Yeah. Okay.
I encountered the college Democrats. They were dumb. I encountered an international answer in the anti-war movement, and like people talking about critical support for Saddam Hussein. Even if you're an anti-war person, is not very palatable. Like,
oh my god.
And I also I went to Sea Island because the second G8 protests were like in my state as opposed to in Seattle, and nobody showed up. Like it was right after 9/11 too. I mean, it makes sense that no one showed up, but no one showed up. And so it was this big conservatizing like time period, because the left in that time period, dude, really sucked. Like
that's what I remember, it basically being non-existent, and the parts that were around were like so like not even caught up with the rest of the world, the left in the rest of the world. I don't know what the fuck happened to the new left after like the 70s. By the time I was getting politicized, those ideas weren't around.
No, I mean, you would meet him, and you meet like this lost generation dude, right? Who's like even at that time period old enough to be your granddad,
right?
Usually, actually, in reality, they were usually about 10 to 15 years younger than my grandfather, but still, like way the fuck older than me. And I would just be listening to them like talk about the civil rights movement and the McGovern campaign, and then like maybe some Trotskyist thing they did, and my eyes would glaze over, and I'd leave. Like, yeah, I mean, like, what the fuck happened? And you left. I was like, go read Culture of Narcissism. I mean, or look at what happened with Bobby Seale or all those people. I mean, pretty much people gave it up. But actually, the best book on this, and I've been suggesting this now for like 10 years, is Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air, because he actually does talk about we didn't really look at what people became when they left the movement. And, you know, if these organizations' numbers would be believed, if you took all the left organizations in the 70s, and there was tons, right, from the SDS all the way to the various communist parties to even the beginnings of the DSA, the Trotskyist groups, etc. In the 70s, there was something like, if you added them all together, there was just under 1 million people involved, which is like, even in the United States, that really is huge. But they were split up over like 120, 130 organizations or something, and they hated each other for stupid reasons. But also, like, no one really paid attention to what happened to them. Like, they just sort of, like, everyone just sort of went away by the time you get to Reagan. And we often think of that as a baby boomer phenomenon, but the funny thing is, a lot of them weren't baby boomers either. A lot of them are actually slightly older than that.
That's true. Like Paul Goodman was like already like a mentor to boomer kids,
right?
So.
I mean, and ironically, some of these people don't get heard of again until like the Obama campaign because they taught at the colleges he did or whatever. But like, it was very interesting to grow up in that time period, because I, like you, like, the left more or less didn't exist, and where it did exist, it was subcultural and weird as fuck, even if you were in the subcultural stuff. Because I was into the subcultural stuff. Even when I was, quote, conservative, I was still, like, going to goth shows and shit. Like, it was yeah, it's a very strange time. We're very off topic, but it
yeah, we're so off topic. I know, but you had, like, you know, you had people like AIDS, HIV denialists hanging out with like fruitarians or like raw vegans, and like you had every weird possible fucking thing there could be was on the left at that time. It was
I was
cool.
about to say, anti-vaxxers now, which are now strongly associated with the right. Back then, I associated with like the far left. Fruitarians and breatharians and people on weird diets who like nearly died. Just conspiracy theorism was rampant.
I don't know if it is more now or less now, to be honest.
I think it's probably more in general society. Well, let me take it back. I think it's more in general society as a politics, because one of the interesting things about 90s and 80s political conspiracyism is that the political part of it was actually kind of rare, but like everybody fucking believed in aliens. Like
that, right? Yeah.
Like, it's interesting. It does not, and I know people get mad at me when I say Gen X is by and large either apolitical or reactionary, but it's in general apolitical or reactionary. And if you think about our childhood, because we're on the tail end of that, I feel like it makes sense. Like, and then if you look at the historical context, and was, I guess, to be a historic materialist to get out of our own like narrativizing here, the Soviet Union fell. China looked like it was liberalizing harder than even the left was at that time period in particular. Economically liberalizing, but not politically liberalizing. Socialism had gone from, in the 70s, seeming ascendant in the developing world to completely collapsing. Like,
right. Exactly.
Like it, and I think people like now, So Marxism did not seem all that appealing because it's like, well, clearly it was wrong. Like, did they not all just disappear? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and in retrospect, that was not true. And there's a lot of anti-communist myths. And like, I think you and I both think we're about to go into another period of pretty profound anti-communism. And one of the things I think is interesting about this, to tie this conversation back into the initial conversation, though, is that you have these ways where there's almost mass movements are, in the case of the early 20th century, they are mass movements, and they fizzle out. Repression does not tend to suppress the mass movement nature of them, but repression is a lot easier to do when the mass movement is fizzling out. So the 1950s is the way the 1950s is for a reason. And there's a lot of ex-communists leading the way on that. And I think we forget that. And one of the things I think we're going to see in the next few years, and I've been talking about this with you for a while, is we're going to see a lot of anti-left stuff from people who we used to consider comrades very soon. And we've already started to see it, really. But they just haven't been important. The one thing I can say about what makes this current generation so hard to predict in this is I don't think it's going to look like traditional conservatism. Although we'll see an uptick in that too. But I don't think that's where people are going to go. I think, in fact, I think a lot of the anti-communist stuff we're going to see is going to come from the center of both parties. So,
well, I totally agree with that. I mean, I've already been saying that for a few years, and trying to look at the anti-communism of the Democrats as being a really important thing to start paying attention to.
Yeah, I think that vote that happened last year, I think it was last year. Yeah, it was last year because when the Democrats still had a majority of the House. To condemn communism, that also basically put like the DPRK and Norway in the same camp. If you like read it, and there's so many Democrats signed on to that, including progressive Democrats, was ridiculous. And people like, well, as a cynical strategy, that doesn't make sense because they're going to call you socialist anyway. I'm like, yeah, but that's not the only reason why they're doing it. like you think this is just about owning the Republicans. This is also about reminding progressives not to get too close to the likes of us, and that that was fine when you're fighting Trump, but
just
it's
to change it a little bit, the topic.
Mm-hmm.
I go back a little bit to what we were saying about the way the Soviet Union plays into the left and even the IWW. I think what happened, and this doesn't have anything to do with the Soviet Union itself, but the fact of its existence, it made socialism seem like something that a state does instead of something that rank and file people do or that grassroots people do. And I think a lot of the world got conditioned to this idea that socialism or communism was really the type of thing that you did if you're a government, but not the type of thing that you did if you were a normal person. And that obviously has nothing to do with any of the ideas or anything, but just like the same way that we think about how, what would be a parallel to this, like owning a hockey team isn't something that I don't know. I can't think of an analogy, but I think it kind of decentered the agency of ordinary people to have the main ideologies competing at such a high level of organization. That when that fell apart, by the time that fell apart, the populaces, not just here, but a lot of places, had lost all of that, that practical know-how and like mental orientation towards politics.
I mean, it's interesting to me. We talked about a lot of the differences between anarchists and Marxists, and then we've gone nostalgic about our own relationship to this tradition as a subculture. 80 years later. But even in Ingalls, if you read the critique of the Offert program, which is mostly supportive of the Offert program, but one of the things he points out is like socialization and nationalization aren't the same thing. Like even Ingalls says
right.
that. Like, and it's not like they were the Ingalls was always opposed to nationalization, but because he wasn't, and he talks about it like in Civil War in France and other places. But the goal is socialization, and that is not the same as nationalizing industry. It's much bigger than that, and that you should never lose sight of that. And that's from Ingalls, right?
Yeah, and I think Lenin understood that difference too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. State and revolution is incomprehensible without understanding that.
Right.
Like, I mean, that's why Lenin is why the critique of the Goethe program is so important. And it's not just because, that one little clause that makes it sound like you can have markets in a socialist society, which is not what Lenin says with that clause, but is what people have used it for. But it's that the way that he thought you would get rid of the state and state and revolution is based off of the criterion spelled out in the critique of the Goethe program. And if anything that I have learned to take anarchists pretty seriously on is this. Marx and Engels didn't hate labor. They didn't hate work. I mean, one of the things that Engels even talks about is like whenever you should say rights, you should also say duties simultaneously, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure anarchists love that. But
well, an existentialist would.
Yeah, I tend to. That's
the whole it's freedom and responsibility, right?
Right.
It's that same. Anyway.
Yeah. No. This is why I think. Like, yeah, of course we have duties, but and equal duties, too, and that's something that I think pretty much everybody's lost sight of. But the one of the things that I really think about all the time is that the number of socialists who even believe that true socialization and withering away of the state is still possible, and I'll actually even talk about that at all, even though it's crucial to Marx. It is crucial. It is kind of astounding to me, and it's kind of almost universal that no one.
And what's crazier about that is that I feel like a lot of socialists or democratic socialists or whatever would at least grant that a good chunk of stuff could be socialized. But now it's like, no, everything is seen through the framework of nationalization. Like, it doesn't matter how stupid and simple the thing is. The idea of socializing it isn't part of the imaginary, which is like, how could you be 100% against socialization?
But yeah, it's for me, and this will be where we end. One of the greatest victories of anti-communism was not just the eradication of so many leftists and the eradication of our ideas from a public sphere. It's also that it changed our own ideas. Like, one, there are communists who will make arguments for communism that are actually structurally anti-communist arguments now. Like, oh, well, we can't do this, so we have to accept this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, that's not, not that there aren't things you have to, I am a materialist. I don't believe you can just, I'm not David Graeber. I don't believe it's all about belief, but, I think that there's this constantly pushing everything back into horizon. And there's also this way in which, like, a lot of anti-communist myths have been accepted. even by communists. And then a lot of them have just been inverted. Like, oh, well, you made up this lie about us. Therefore, the thing that this critique must either be completely false, or if it's not false, it was good anyway. Like, let's go and defend Yusuf and Beria, because that's something to do. And I think that is absurd. But what it tells me is that this anti-communism has actually limited our own imagination and capacity, and made our subcultures rigid. And and when there's a failure, it really shows up, because all of a sudden the left seems, I mean, I think right now it's not as bad as the 90s, but it's close. Like, and it's amazing that all it took was a second Bernie defeat and everyone lost their fucking minds. And that's on the scale of world historical defeats, that's pathetic. Like, right, to have that low of a bar and a threshold.
Yeah. Like, that should be the normal occurrence, is having at least that much of a defeat.
like come on. But if you want to see this where it gets really pathological, don't look at the United States. What happened to the British left after Corbyn?
Oh yeah,
it doesn't seem to even exist, like, at all. You know, yes, there are individuals, but you know.
Well, I mean, how many? What is it? 10 years post-Occupy, all these. The left has been putting all their bets on an electoral strategy, and then they shit the bed on it. So what? You know, they're not going to go back and like say they were wrong about any of that. They're just going to fucking double down.
But do it with RFK and Cornel West, which, look, I don't think Cornel West is a ridiculous figure, but like, I'm like, you guys don't see that this is just a reversion back to the 80s and 90s, with like, you had the sadder like outputs of the Green Party over and over again.
Oh yeah.
And then you'd have these like dark horse left candidates like Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel and the Democratic Party, or Cynthia McKinney, and they get weirder and weirder over time, and they were utterly ineffective, and they usually only command about 1 or 2% of the vote. And it seems pretty clear that we're headed straight back into that. But since people have come up under Bernie, they don't even recognize that this is a reversion to a norm. Like,
I just don't understand why can the historical left learn this lesson about electoralism, but today's left can't? Why you didn't have to be an anarchist to understand that it could be a waste of money, at least a waste of money, to go into electoral politics. There's just no sense. Actually, money might be the main thing, I think.
I think it's money and cluster bombs.
The fact that nobody's fucking paying dues into an organization, whether it's a union or whatever, I think they don't understand how much of even radical politics is about money. It's always has been. It's always been a matter of how to raise funds, whether it's a strike fund or taking over the Bank of France or whatever it is. But now no one wants to put their money into anything collective unless it's like a Kickstarter campaign for like a board game or something.
I'm a dues paying union member, but it ain't cheap either. But anyway, I think that I know that's just a hard thing to remind people, and I also, I mean, we can see what the electoralism does and the incentive structures it induces. And I hate to pick on the DSA, but we need to. When you look at the DSA, because like how much of their resources go into just maintaining the staffing apparatus to be able to run campaigns, and the cost that incurs, which basically means that 80% of every local goes into what amounts to campaigns in New York and California, which, by the way, the DSA already had effectively a cadre and caucus in as early as the 1980s. It's actually an older thing there in New York. And so it's like, okay, so now you need what, 80,000 people to do what you used to do with 5,000 to be regionally effective.
But you know what
caucus.
I'm saying though too? I mean, like, it's like people expect, it's like they think politics is something you could get done for free or something like that. Like,
what requires is your money and our time.
The fact that small donations, did so much for the Bernie campaign, to me, I think is actually a big achievement for the left, who hasn't been able to get anybody to spend money on anything. And it really like makes like a case for the conservatives when the left doesn't even want to put money into their own cause. That, when they accuse the left of just wanting things for free and wanting handouts.
Well, this is one thing I think that maybe this is going to be one of the more unpopular things I say tonight. I have been surprised at, like, even our new sectarian organizations. Like, there's all these new kind of weird political movements, right, that are popping up. But they're like hashtag movements. They don't even require time. And then I will say why a lot of people are hesitant to get money in, and I will probably leave this alone, is how many times have they been ripped off? Like, how many of those donations to one of the 85,000 nominally BLM organizations, since anyone could use the nomenclature.
Right. But from an anarchist perspective, that's exactly, I mean, that's the right incentive structure. You want people to be afraid of wasting their money. You still want them to put money into it, but you want them to care enough so that it doesn't get wasted on politics in some stupid way.
Or wasted on enriching somebody.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yes, obviously, but also, like, I don't know. I mean, I guess this is a fundamentally different problem than the IWW in the early 20th century, and that even though for some people stakes are higher and needs are actually there, like, this is not all about, oh, it's all PMC, blah blah blah. Yeah, there's that probably a lot of that strata of elites probably does define a lot of higher level interest in these movements, because they define higher level interest in all movements. But it's a problem of bureaucracy and resources. But one of the problems that we have here is that, I was talking about, like, these new, like, weird political things that are almost like cargo calls to have tons of followers on Twitter or whatever, but they don't have any manifestation in the real world at all, even like compared to other weird sectarian groups, because they don't have any drive to build institutions, because it doesn't seem like they're even interested in collecting cash other than for individuals through, like, clicks, parasocial interactions, podcast support, things like that. And, I say this as a person with a podcast too, but I'm not pretending to build a political movement off of this by itself.
No, I mean, yeah, that's an additional problem too. This whole thing about representation and the way that a podcaster becomes a representative or whatever for a phantom movement or something.
But when you don't have skin in the game, be that money, time, or whatever, you can also have delusions a lot easier, because
that's what I mean. Yeah.
What incentive do you have not to? Like, because it's not like you're actually doing any fucking thing. Like,
right.
And I think we encounter a lot of Marxists right now who have, like, kind of fundamentally broken reality. And I am just one time I'm going to come down on Marxist, broken reality on what their beliefs can affect. 'Cause, like, people really care about what you say you believe, as if some minor podcaster somewhere is really changing the world. And two, like it's like you're ideologically purging and you don't have power and you don't have any reasons to. But two, even more importantly, in some ways, they can feel like having these opinions or doing this advocacy is consciousness raising, but it's not even the consciousness raising of like the late new left, which that was stupid too, by the way. but like,
oh yeah, I just did that whole Marcuse thing.
But yeah, I think, you know, I'm going to keep all this in because I think this is good stuff. Although I think I'm going to denote about an hour and a half in, we give up on our actual topic because we finished it.
Yeah. Well, just for the continuity, the Wobblies were able to raise money. They had a treasury. They did all that shit. So, okay, go on.
I mean, they raised money and fuck, they even kind of had, I mean, they didn't have a militia, but they kind of did. Like,
yeah.
Could you imagine today? I remember one time I said this and I was being serious and people thought I was joking, but I was like, I will take the DSA seriously when it has a soccer team and a militia. Like,
yeah.
So
I mean, like the YMCA has a soccer team or whatever, you know, what. I mean,
like, if it takes the social stuff beyond like communist movie group, because the social functioning is actually important. Like,
of course.
Yeah, and I think anarchists often get this, and Marx is like, I'm like, no, dude, like the SP, like, somebody informed me recently, and I was verifying this, like half of the clubs in British football come out of like workers and immigrant organizations initially, and I was like, which makes their current status really darkly ironic, admittedly, but like, it's just like, yeah. There's a reason why these social things are important. And, you know, yes, politics is not a church. The left is not a church, but maybe you should learn something from a fucking church.
Right. Or a corporation. Fuck. I mean,
yeah.
I bet there's a Facebook soccer team.
The last thing I will say about this, though, is I will say this generalization about money is actually kind of pervasive in society as a whole because churches are dying from it, too. And I don't know, like that's the part of me is like, well, people like, yeah, circumstances compel your alienation, but people really don't seem to actually indicate that they don't like it. Like, even though they say they don't, and they act miserable, and every indication socially is that they're miserable, but like, to like, one thing about both Marxist and anarchist politics, and I think people do need to understand this, it does make demands on people.
Yep.
Like, it's not just something that you can just believe. And if you're just a philosophical Marxist or you're just a philosophical anarchist, I mean, that's cool, but you might as well be like a philosophical Tolkienist or something. I mean, it's just it at that point it really is an intellectual subculture. And look, I'm as much of a nerd as anybody. As people watch this show can tell you, I retreat in the history all the time, and I think it's important that we talk about the historical stuff as a way of understanding and contrasting our own situation. But we also have to be honest about where we are, and I'm not as involved with anarchist milieus anymore as I used to be. I actually used to organize a lot locally with people who were both involved with the anarchist movements and the PSL until they kind of tore each other apart, and then COVID happened and nobody does anything. Although, ironically, Breck Hammer actually showed up to some of this and recruited people and actually accelerated the decline of some of these organizations. That was fun. So for people who think that's just on the internet, no, it's not. But the one thing I would say is when you actually do like activist work, you will have to work with people who are not necessarily of your ideology, and that, so like anarchists and PSL people will work together all the time. Conversely, though, and I know you probably agree with me on this, a lot of activist work at this point is basically spinning your wheels. Like
Mm-hmm.
it isn't actually doing much. And so, you know, a lot of people I know who devoted a whole lot of time to it, particularly in the Trump administration, have kind of walked away. And I think that's also what happened in the 1970s with the New Left. And so, and I also think from my studies on Christopher Lasch, that's actually a lot of what happened in the 1950s during the Red Scare too, even though the state was definitely helping that out, but that a lot of people left on their own. And I think we need to understand that and understand our own relationship to that. And yeah, people have to put you have to have skin in the game. It's money or time.
Like, yeah, and then there is going to be a cost benefit thing that's going to eventually play out where you're going to have to say, has all this time and money been worth it?
Oh yeah, if you don't get something back for your money, don't do it. Like that's right. The other thing. I'm like, if people are just like, give me your money for this noble sacrifice for socialism in like 1,000 years, fuck that shit. Like right. Even churches give you something right now. Like,
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And I think, you know, we can't just keep running away from that part of things. It doesn't have to be like fucking digging a hole in the ground, you know, and building houses in Mexico or something. But you got to do something.
Although, as a person who has dug a underground and literally built schools in Mexico, like actually, literally, it's not a bad thing to do if you have the
no
want someone else to paying for you to do.
No, I'm saying it's hard, but yeah. No, what did you do? The Housing for Humanity or one of those?
No. I my job actually was a community owned school. It was a private school, it was community owned, but it's for rich people. But they would assuage their consciousness and ours by building schools for poor people. Nice. So I would, you know, go out and help, and we would put up buildings, and we would teach English to little Mexican ranchero kids. And we'd also like help their parents do stuff like get microloans to like build like ovens with chimneys. Like, I mean, I know it just makes Mexico sound more backwards than it is, but like the uneven development in Mexico is extreme. Because, you know, you can be in Monterrey and you might as well be in America, actually, as far as like, you know, luxuries and stuff. But then if you go to some of these rancheros, it's like this community has no running water. It doesn't have necessarily consistent electricity. You know, and like, it doesn't have necessarily even like consistent wood burning infrastructure. So there's, you know, it's a good thing to do if you can do it. The unfortunate thing is, unless you get a job like I did, it's unfortunately like a province of assuaging the conscience of the upper middle class, because usually they're the people who can afford to do that. Which is kind of the problem with activism, right? Because of this money problem right now, since we're not doing micro stuff around it. And we're dumping all of this stuff into like electoral campaigns. Then we don't have the money to do this. And when people tell me, well, the left has no money, and I'm like, it doesn't have as much as the right, but actually, yes, it does. Like, it has money. Like, we have actually made socialist advocate millionaires. They are at least 100,000-aires. They exist.
Like, if you look at the lifestyle habits, I mean, come on. It's
right.
Speaking of lifestyle, though, I gotta
head out. Yeah, we can talk for 2 hours and a half. Thank you so much for coming on, Cyber Dandy. I'm trying not to use your real name, and I'm going to put, so people who want to dig into this, you sent me some notes. Is it okay if I share those in the show notes?
Sure. Yeah. They're rough, but yeah.
Yeah, but you include your sources so people can look at them. Thank you so much. So, where can people find you, Cyber?
Either my website, cyberdandy.org, or on YouTube at cyberdandy.
All right. And I will put those also in the show notes. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.